It's the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in Samoa with leaders of the 56 Commonwealth nations all gathering for the first summit since King Charles took the throne in the United Kingdom. Some of those attending from African and Caribbean nations have talked of wanting to use the occasion to demand an apology from Britain for its colonial past and pay financial reparations for our role in the slave trade.
We didn't quite know, Kamal, did we, whether he might follow what David Lammy said in opposition, where the now Foreign Secretary appeared to support the idea of reparations, or whether he'd go his own way.
Many of our countries have died. It's 52 years since independence. All of the countries are celebrating independence in different ways. But one of the things that comes across to me is how well they have done with what they were left. And part of that discussion then brings the story of reparations back on the table. Because the truth is that the people who got reparations after slavery were the slave owners. This country stopped paying off the debt to the slave owners in 2015. 2015, no reparations were ever given to any slaves. Now, what Caribbean leaders are saying is, can we have a new relationship that isn't about David Cameron turning up in Jamaica and saying, we're going to build you a prison. And you're going to pay for it.
In fact, he did the latter, telling reporters, and I quote, "We can't change our history." He did describe the slave trade as abhorrent and said that it was important to talk about our history. But along with Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, there doesn't seem to be that much appetite for coming up with money that they say that Britain doesn't have. I mean, we know what they've been saying about 22 billion black holes and all the rest of it. And indeed, the Chancellor, addressing the issue of slavery reparations, has said it's not something that this government is doing.
Given the UK government's position, I'm sure nothing hugely substantive will happen at this CHOGM, but there may be movement in the future. But before we come to our guests, let's just have a little look at this debate around slavery and reparations. It's certainly a debate that's lasted for centuries. If you go right back to 1837, just after the abolition of slavery, there was the Slavery Compensation Act. And that was money paid to those who had owned slaves. It was £20 million, and that would be around £2.8 billion in today's money. That was a cash payment to slave owners. But also, slaves were obliged to work for a period of time after the abolition of slavery for free. And the total value, supposedly, of all slaves at that time was £47 million. And that's about £6.6 billion in today's money. A massive report really put some flesh on the bones of this issue. Arthur Lewis in 1939, he's a Nobel laureate economist, said that the compensation issue really relied on an analysis of what he described as 200 years of free labour from 20 million black people. That is what he said was the economic value of slavery to the United Kingdom. The Prime Minister of Barbados, Mia Mottley, she's been at the forefront of this recent debate and the increasingly strong claims from Caribbean countries that reparations should be made. Here she is explaining why she feels so strongly that it has to happen.
These conversations are painful. And these conversations may offend some, but they ought not to, because we are mature. And we must have the capacity to have mature conversations because we are not children. And that ability to have conversations, even when we are directly complicit, must never escape us.
It's interesting that that claim is being led by Mia Mottley in Barbados, Kamal, because with the King at CHOGM, it's slightly embarrassing, isn't it? Because Barbados was recently dispensed itself of its head of state, of the King, deciding to go republic. And that was on the basis of a political decision rather than a public referendum. And we can have a separate discussion about that. What's the attitude in the UK, though? Well, probably not surprising that a poll taken 10 years ago showed that the majority of Brits do not agree that European countries should be paying compensation for past ills. Also, this is the major question, isn't it? How would it be done? How would this money be paid? Who would it be paid to? How would it be managed? It's not something, by the way, that is a recent phenomenon. As you say, Kamal, this debate has been going back not just decades, but centuries. You'll remember, won't you, Kamal, that Tony Blair did on several occasions express sorrow for slavery. He expressed his deep sorrow in 2006. He then went further in 2007 with a full apology. And that had come after he had apologised for the Irish famine of the 19th century. That was in 1997. It was part of the lead up to paving the way for the Good Friday Agreement in 1998. So, to be fair, I think some good can come of public contrition. Can some good come of public money going towards slavery reparations? So that's the question.
Well, to try and answer that question, Camilla, and the broader question of reparations, we're now joined by two people with very different takes on the issue. Laura Trevelyan is a journalist. She worked for the BBC for 30 years, and she's also honorary fellow at the University of the West Indies P.J. Patterson Institute. She's joining the podcast from Grenada. And Lord Tony Sewell, the Conservative peer. He's an educational consultant and chief executive of the charity Generating Genius. Lots of people will remember him for chairing the Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities for the Boris Johnson government. And he's joining us from Jamaica. So two ideal countries to talk about to kick off this conversation. Laura, let's start with you. Your family story is deeply entwined in the debates around slavery and reparations. Just take us through some of the Trevelyan experience.
Well, thanks, Kamal, Camilla, Tony. Great to be with you all. Yeah, basically, the history of the Trevelyan family is like a microcosm of Britain's elite and the way that it was intertwined with slavery in the 18th and 19th centuries. Lady Louisa Simon, she's the daughter of a French Huguenot slave trader. She marries Sir John Trevelyan in 1757. And with that, slavery and plantations in the Caribbean come into the Trevelyan family through marrying up, essentially. And when slavery was abolished in 1834, the Trevelyan family had at various times owned 10 different plantations, sugarcane plantations in Grenada, where I'm speaking to you from today. And at abolition, the Trevelyans part owned 1,000 enslaved Africans. And our family was given the equivalent of millions of pounds in today's money in compensation at abolition, because that was how it worked. It wasn't the enslaved that got compensation. Britain's slave owners got £20 million in 1834. It took the government until 2015, by the way, to pay off that enormous amount of money, because it was the only way to get abolition through Parliament, a classic compromise. I only learnt about this history when UCL published its database of compensation to Britain's slave owners in 2016, and that set me off on a bit of a journey.
And Laura, can you just take us through that journey and then what happened in terms of reparation from your family to Grenada?
Well, basically, my bosses at the BBC let me go to make a documentary in 2022 using this personal history as a way into the debate here in Grenada about reparations and reparatory justice in the wake of George Floyd's murder and that reckoning over racial justice, which engulfed so many institutions and countries. So when I came here, my boss at the BBC said, Laura, you can't do this documentary without asking every single person that you meet, should I apologise for what my ancestors did, and should I pay reparations, or am I liable? So I did ask everybody, whether it was the chair of Grenada's reparations committee, the ladies in the market, the school children, and the answer came back a resounding yes on both counts. And yes, because an apology would be meaningful to us, because we still bear the pains of the past. And yes, reparations, because your ancestors enslaved us and all of the wealth left the country. So to me, there was a moral clarity to it. And after the documentary, our family worked with Grenadians who said, come here, publicly apologise. That will be important. I gave £100,000 towards education causes in Grenada. We've set up a family charity, which is why I'm here in Grenada now on that business. And Caribbean leaders said, we're just waiting for centuries for the descendants of enslavers to come and just begin a conversation about how the past informs the present.
Tony, let's bring you into the conversation. You've been critical of this whole debate, but especially the Church of England's Slavery Reparation Fund. It set that up with £100 million last year to recognise that it once profited from the slave trade. Can you just talk us through your criticisms of that?
I think, can I just say one thing just to preface this? Look, people giving money to causes, be it the church or whatever, or individuals, that's up to them. Give what you want. I give, myself, but I don't tell anybody about it. I've now broken that rule, which is bad. But I mean, in a way, that's almost what I want to feel is the basis of some of my criticism. Look, I think that one of the problems we have here is, and it's interesting that the church has got itself almost sort of morally tied up in this, is this issue around guilt and a sense of how do I pay back, almost a moral driven thing. Can I just say one thing here in Jamaica, where Laura, I'm really interested in your sort of research, because believe me, most people, in Jamaica, if you ask them, do I want some money? They would just tell you yes. I mean, that's just, I mean, no one's going to say no. They'd say that in England as well, for whatever cause. But what happens with the church, I think, is it's trying to sort of, in a sort of religious way, redeem itself. And I don't know really whether that will ever happen. Let me tell you the damage, Camilla, that I think is going to happen here. I think that the power dynamics change. So, for example, what happens is that once you talk about reparations on a personal level, it's almost another repetition of a slave master dynamic, because what happens is you, outsider, becomes a power broker in the sense to me here, and you're changing my life. I don't have the agency in this anymore. I don't have the, which is really what slavery was really about, in a sense, taken away. And so you come in and say, look, I'm going to give you the money, and that's going to change your life. And that's the real way in which it's going to work. So on a personal level, there isn't any real kind of reparations here. It's more of the same, but in a little sort of liberal kind of elite way of doing it. The second problem is what you're having now in Samoa, where in Jamaica, believe it or not, we do not need any cash. We don't need any money. Our problems are not about money. Our problems are about fixing roads, water, very practical things that need to be done. And the leadership that we've got down here is crap. They just don't know. Basically, what we need are great ideas. Very, very familiar to what happened to us in the Conservative Party in the way in which we did government. We just didn't deliver. So what about getting that fixed and thinking about that? And so what happens is these leaders go away to Samoa, they read about Laura Trevelyan and whatever, and then they go in and they say, this is the problem. And so in a sense, it's almost a way of diverting what their obligations should be here. So I think those two things are the problem with it. It's not about giving, it's about adding to the problem.
Can I just put that to you, Laura, because there is something quite ironic here about a white woman advocating for reparations and a black man saying they shouldn't be paid. It seems to me that Tony's sort of suggesting that you have a white saviour complex in some way, Laura. Is that fair?
Well, yes, an advanced case of white saviour neo-colonialism, you might say. I mean, I guess what I would say to that is that everything that our family's done has been in concert with Grenadians. Arlie Gill, the chair of Grenada's National Reparations Committee, is someone that I hope that you would all have on your show at some point. And Lolita Davis-Mattis, who's the chair of Jamaica's National Reparations Committee, who I know well. I went to Jamaica in August. Stephen Golding, who's on that committee in Jamaica. These are all Caribbean intellectuals who've been thinking about this for ages, since Eric Williams' Capitalism and Slavery book in 1944, going back to Sir Arthur Lewis in 1939, Nobel laureate who wrote about this, the concept of Britain's Black Death. So I guess what I would say is everything that we've done has been led by Grenadians, been in concert with Grenadians. But I totally agree with Tony, funnily enough, about the Church of England Fund. Because what Grenadian leaders have said about that is the church just decided £100 million. They didn't discuss with the Caribbean where that money should go. And it seems like the church is going to slice it up a million different ways and give it to a million different projects. So the danger is it doesn't have any impact. Whereas to Tony's point, in Jamaica, people in Jamaica have told me we desperately need a new hospital. How about if the church's 100 million quid went to build a hospital in Jamaica? You know, something that would actually make an impact, rather than the risk with what the church are doing is that they just try to please everybody in true Church of England style, and all the amounts are so small that they don't add up to anything. So it is a really complex area. But I would say, you know, here in Grenada, Hurricane Beryl, and that also affected Jamaica, where Tony is, in July, strongest storm ever to form in the Atlantic that early in the season, flattened Grenada's northern islands of Carriacou, Petit Martinique. They're desperately trying to build back better here. This is something, and Keir Starmer hinted at this. He said, let me roll up my sleeves and work with Commonwealth countries on future-facing issues like climate. Well, this is something where Britain could make a difference, and not just by telling the international financial institutions not to lend at such high interest rates, but by having a multi-generational plan to help make these islands climate resilient.
Can I ask another? Let me put something outrageous to you. How about this? How about people in Grenada and Jamaica coming together and getting a fund and helping people in England? Have you ever thought about that?
Go on, Tony. Continue with that.
Tell us.
I'm serious. How about us in this country coming together and looking at ways in which we can help the wider world? What do you think about that?
Sounds like a good idea. What do you mean specifically?
No, you see what it does. You see, that kind of question is a very interesting one, because it immediately looks at. In fact, you know, we've been doing. You know, there's a lot of irony in that. You know, because Jamaicans have been going up to the US and doing lots of projects helping them. Their nurses go up there. They help with the nursing system in America. The teaching dynamic here, we've got great teachers going to America and coming to England as well and helping in the system here. We're already in some dynamic way helping the so-called mother country. Obviously there's employment, but we're actually helping to fix some of the problems out here. India is a very interesting example here, because India is now perceived as a country that is not just where there's a begging bowl and we're there to help India. Now the individual and the country is seen as a serious player. And that's where I think, Laura, we've got to change the dynamic here and look at what's going on. And we've got to bring local Caribbean leaders to account to stop the incompetence and the corruption, and really be serious about fixing their country. Believe me, we do not need the cash.
Do you think, Tony, there is any role, let's say for the Commonwealth, so maybe less of a master to victim relationship, which would be just Britain doing something? Is there any way for the Commonwealth to build funds in the way that Laura is talking about, so not having to go to the World Bank and the IMF, where, as you say, Laura, very high interest rates can be charged for debt, and putting in place development opportunities, technology, which could help all members of the Commonwealth as well as the Caribbean? Do you think there's anything which does lean into the idea, at least, of some form of reconciliation, given, as Laura has pointed out, the number of academic studies, economist studies on the fact that particularly the Caribbean has been so badly affected by slavery?
Yeah, look, on a psychological level, I don't know if necessarily we have a problem in Jamaica. We have a problem the other way. Most Jamaicans think they can run the world. They think they're actually in charge. They think they're better than any prime minister. You know, you've got a little country here that has shown the world how to do athletics completely transformed that sport. You've got a little country here, only 2 million, that have transformed the music industry completely. Yeah. So Kamal, in a sense, what you're saying is interesting. I think it can be done internally within the Commonwealth. The dynamics are going to be changed. Personally, I wish India would take the leadership now. I think they're in a position to start taking over this. I've noticed there's not been one Indian origin leader in the leadership contest for that, which is sad. But no, I think my point is that the actual issue about reparations and slavery is actually, ironically, a burden, actually a distraction. It's not helping us. And any more dynamic about you owe us and what we're going to do takes away from the reality here of the fact that this country has in its past, even though it's had a slave history, has an ability to really help the world. So it's a case of ideas. It's a case of dynamic leadership. It's a case of, look at Singapore as one example of a country very similar to Jamaica, but it actually is a place now where people are going to there. It's an investor. It's a completely different dynamic. And why was that? Nothing to do with reparations. It was to do with the way in which that country organized itself and stopped the incompetence and the corruption that besets these islands. I think that's the problem.
Laura, can I say that, listening to you now, what you've done as a family, I think there's something really honourable about it. I think there's really something honourable about we as the Trevelyans are taking responsibility for our past. And I know you got a lot of flack at the time. There was a lot of eye rolling. You were accused of being woke and virtue signalling.
My children would tell you that I am the least woke person on the planet, by the way. They thought that was very funny. They think I'm a dinosaur.
Fair enough. Well, thank you for confirming that. So I think, what you've tried to do has been done with the best of intentions. Could it just be that individual families like the Trevelyans might want to take one path, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we should all be taking responsibility for what happened hundreds of years ago, not least at a time where financially it's unaffordable. There's also an irony, isn't there, of people in this country in lower socioeconomic groups may well be the children of immigrants, and they may well be people of colour. If our government gives slavery reparations to Caribbean countries and African countries that they come from, they could be disadvantaged in Britain.
Well, the tax system is unfair, isn't it? Look at the way that between 1834 and 2015, it was paying off a debt to Britain's enslavers. Strange things happen with tax systems. But what I think is going to be really interesting in all of this is the communique that comes out of the Commonwealth, because we're talking about the Commonwealth. It's no longer an association of Britain's former colonies. It has matured. It's become a very important non-aligned bloc in a complicated, polarized world. It's not in the orbit of America. It's not in the orbit of China. It's not in the orbit of Russia. Mostly the countries are democracies. There is a lot of common affection. If the communique at the end of all of this comes out with something about, the language that was leaked to The Guardian was about noting calls for discussion on reparatory justice. There's a distinction, by the way, between reparations, which is a legal term, meaning cash that you give people to repair the harm of the past, and reparatory justice, which is much more nuanced, it's more moral, it's broader, it's maybe just a way into a conversation about, as the King Charles rather elegantly put it when he spoke to Chogham. He said he's listened to people across the Commonwealth and the painful past still resonates. So, we're all grown up enough and mature enough to maybe just start a conversation about that.
There is a nice line by Bob Marley that talks about this whole idea of slavery and almost like the mental reparations thing. And he's great on this because I don't think he wanted reparations at all. I think he's interested in that. What he says in his songs and his whole kind of ideology is that we've got to sort of free ourselves from mental slavery, but none but ourselves can do that. Yeah. And it might sound a little kind of, but if you go into it, what he's actually saying is that the journey. So in a way, the problem, I think, is this whole notion that, and I'd like to ask Laura, why do you think kids here in Jamaica really do think they can't go about the world until they have some kind of psychological thing about slavery or reparations? That's a done issue. There are big issues now, and even if they've already started that process. And in fact, I would argue that in Jamaica in particular, it's over. We're at a point now mentally where, and we don't really want to be going back again to that madness. So what we want to do now is, how do we engage with the world? How do we now become, a dynamic country in the world? It's not about, I've got to sit down with the Trevelyans and work out what happened with my grandmother, and I've got to take all this white stuff out of me and whatever. That's not. We don't need that. So that that dynamic seems a very strange one. I mean, why would we want to have a conversation about that?
Well, no, I agree with you on one level. Why would you want to have a kind of sort of introspective conversation about the past that didn't go anywhere? But what I would say, being here in Grenada, when I talk to people, they say, look, we have abundant amounts of sun and wind. We want to transition to a blue economy. Carriacou, the little island north of Grenada that was flattened by Hurricane Beryl, one of their climate, battery operating facilities was flattened by that. My point is just that, here in Grenada, people would like to have electric cars, be so much cheaper than buying gas because everything is imported here. They want to invest in a blue economy, and Britain's in a position to help with that. That would help Britain's own emerging renewable energy industry. And also the sense, to Tony's point, so many people in Grenada, their parents went to Britain as part of the Windrush generation. Their grandparents went. People are coming back now. They're retiring. There are these historic ties which are celebrated, and people don't want to be in the pocket of China here in Grenada. This is a democracy. It has a young Prime Minister, Dickon Mitchell, elected in a change election 2 years ago. They would like a more meaningful relationship with Britain, which I think is what this is about, which recognises the past, but also celebrates the ties and the way the Windrush generation helped to build Britain, the way people are coming back here to retire with their UK pensions. It's a complicated present, but climate change is a real and present danger for Grenada. Britain's government could help with a multi-generational commitment to invest in blue energy here.
Tony, just react to that, but also, as you are in education, perhaps to round this off and look to the future, we've been having this debate now for decades. Do you think this is still going to be debated in decades' time? What do the younger generation think of all this, Tony?
I think the younger generation in Jamaica are not interested. I remember when the George Floyd incident happened, and about 5 people went outside the American embassy, nobody wanted to go outside the British embassy because they wanted visas, so they didn't really want to go and protest too hard. So it's a complete. I think the mindset here is completely different than that. But for the future, I think that the debate here will be one about, I think, an expanding middle class that's coming here now, and I think we have a relationship with Britain that's interesting. But to be honest, we're so close to the US. I think it will be a serious link with that and how that works. One thing, look, let me just think. What Laura said just a minute ago, I think is absolutely on point. Every single thing that she just said about the dynamic of how Britain can work with the thing. It's the wrapping it up in reparations. It's that is not needed, and that's what I'm trying to say. Is that you can do all of those things, and hopefully Britain will do some of those things with the Caribbean, but it doesn't need to have that discourse. So I think the future here is a difficult one, and I think that what it does need is entrepreneurs like Laura coming into the space and probably doing something. But you don't have to talk about reparations. It's just doing stuff, Yeah, and then I think the other thing, just to add, is the leadership. We do need some lessons on how to lead. Jamaica's football team is actually being led by a Brit. You know what I mean? And it hasn't lost a match yet. You know, I mean, this is a very English. Some of the stuff here you would recognise very much as an English tradition. But on the other hand, I think that's another dynamic for the future that we could actually not be ashamed of, and actually kind of do more to kind of help Jamaica on its way. But my sense very much here is that we need to free it from a danger that it can be just going into this dependency. So that's my hope, is that if anything, the liberation is around get the apron strings completely away from the mother so we can get on with it.
Baron Sewell and Laura Trevelyan, thank you so much for that fascinating and intensely intelligent discussion.
Kamal, what I loved about that very nuanced and thoughtful conversation is Tony and Laura left that chat vowing to meet up either at the House of Lords or at Goldeneye, Ian Fleming's premises in Jamaica, which is what this is all about, because it's become a very incendiary debate, and it's actually at some points become quite nasty, and I just don't know how that advances any of the arguments. My only point as I was listening to it was I was thinking, we spent so much time looking backwards, and I asked that question of Tony about looking forwards, because let's be perfectly honest, modern slavery is happening as we speak. What is the point of looking back 100 or so years and trying to make up for stuff that's done now, and not channeling all of our energy into stopping it happening again? You know, and not just modern slavery in this country, anybody who's gone to the Middle East and knows how some workers are kept in some of those countries as they are tending to our tables and manning the bar and cleaning the hotel rooms and cleaning the streets, knows how those people live, okay? And it's not great, and it's not representative of modern society in 2024. Why can't we be having those conversations rather than these ones, which I do regard as being regressive?
I'm sure it's not either or. What I loved, I think, like you, about Laura and Tony, it was a very smart but also very respectful conversation. I can see a lot of good in what, not only what Laura has done, because as you said, it is important for families and businesses to be able to have their own journey on this and do, what they think is right with conversation with the affected communities. But the whole debate about we should be using the Commonwealth more aggressively to help development for all countries. I love the point that Tony made. Wouldn't it be great if Jamaica came and helped us? And I do very much agree with this idea of what's called the aid mentality that the West can have. You are the victims, we give you money. And very famous economist from Zambia called Dambisa Moyo, and she argues about dead aid, that this idea of handing people money to help them is a very bad, sets up a very poor relationship, and it should be seen as the responsibilities of the country, but with the support of the Commonwealth. And I think actually Tony and Laura were not far apart on that. Certainly I agree, and I think Laura agreed with this when she talked about the trillions of pounds. I remember listening to a talk Barack Obama gave, because obviously this is a huge debate in America and very divisive in America, much more divisive than in the UK. And he spoke about reparations being morally appealing but practically flawed. And I think that's absolutely right. I think that I'm not as well a huge fan of national apologies. I think that's a never-ending road. And also, again, I think it, depresses the people that the apology comes from. You mentioned that poll about people feeling very negative about the idea of paying for past ills, whether that's the UK or other European countries. But it also means that, again, you've got this idea of us in the West offering our sort of a gift of our apology to you poor people. And I think the balance has completely changed. I think there's one final point. Tony raised this issue of the Commonwealth and India being in a leadership position. two countries that aren't at CHOGM are India and South Africa, two of the biggest economies in the Commonwealth. Where are they? They are at the summit with President Putin. So we've got so many, we've got so much, there are so many vital issues we need to solve. Let's make the Commonwealth powerful. Let's make it innovative. Let's make it a joint endeavour, whatever your history may be. And let's recognise our colonial ties, our deep historical ties, that we are a partnership, and look to the future.
I agree. And also in the post-Brexit era, that was what it was all meant to be about. One of the main arguments for leave is we've got this obviously neighbourly relationship with the continent, and that's only right. But there is more that unites us than divides us when it comes to some of our Commonwealth cousins. I mentioned the late Queen earlier. I mean, she was the world's most travelled ambassador. But my goodness, she really felt that it was so important to foster ties between Britain and countries in the Commonwealth for mutual beneficial reasons. Yes, we have a shared history. Some of history is unpleasant and needs to be accounted for and dealt with. But there's a positive future, surely, moving forward between Britain and some of these countries. And I agree with you, deeply disturbing to find Prime Minister Modi sort of in bed with this newly emerging axis of evil, rather than being with our king and indeed our prime minister and other Western leaders at CHOGM.
But what a lovely debate, a real daily tea classic. I love the fact that we can have conversations like this.